Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. We will start in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone, again, and a very warm welcome to this masterclass on grant proposal writing. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us this afternoon. My name is Shubomi Obade, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Innovations for Poverty Action and the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab are committed to expanding the development research network by including more Global South researchers. We believe that by making research more locally grounded, by increasing the engagement of researchers from LMIC countries, it will likely lead to more policy relevant and impactful studies. This webinar will cover strategies for structuring a proposal, identifying common mistakes and how to fix them. We're also sharing experiences from going through the proposal development stage and some insights and open calls at the very end, so please stay tuned. We hope you leave feeling more confident about your ability to write strong proposals for your next funding application. Great. Just to go over a few housekeeping announcements, this webinar will be recorded and we'll share the recording after the session. But please, during the presentations, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box right at the bottom of the screen. I'm happy to know some people are already familiar with it. And we will respond to as many questions as we can in the chat, and a few of them during the Q&A session at the very end. During the Q&A session, we'll also make provisions for some people to ask their questions at that point in time. So if you have a question to ask, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can speak. I'll jump right into introducing our amazing panelists. We have a great set of people who will be speaking this afternoon, starting off with Claire Hofmeyer, who is an education training manager at JPAL Africa. She leads JPAL Africa's training activities, as well as the drive to increase the representation of African researchers within JPAL's network and experimental economics. Prior to joining the JPAL team in 2021, Claire worked in the field of monitoring and evaluation for Mothers to Mothers and Fair Deal Consulting. Her previous experience includes conducting trainings, policy writing, and communications work at Saldru, as well as at JPAL Africa, where she was part of the first team when the office opened in 2010. Claire holds a master's in applied economics from the University of Cape Town and a bachelor's in economics and finance from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Our second panelist is Ethan Paul, who is a research manager at JPAL Global at MIT. He manages JPAL's research and pipeline activities, research staff trainings, and resources. Ethan also conducts his own research related to political economy and governance in Southeast Asia. Ethan has served as a principal investigator and co-investigator for several randomized evaluations and other studies related to social accountability, democratic representation, and the distribution of public goods in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. He holds a PhD in public policy and political science from the University of Michigan, an MA in law and diplomacy from Tufts University, and a BS in foreign service from Georgetown University. Our third panelist is Rachel Steinecker, and she is IPA's Director of Program and Business Development. Rachel has been with IPA since 2013. She most recently served as IPA's Deputy Regional Director for East Africa and Country Director for IPA Tanzania, managing the development of IPA's formal presence, country program, and portfolio of research in that country. Prior to that, she was part of IPA Kenya's senior management team. She has led 30+ research projects in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Her management experience spans the sectors of water and sanitation, food security, poverty reduction, financial inclusion, mental health, cognitive development, health, and education. Our fourth panelist is Bianca Marie Livioco, and she is a Senior Program Development Associate for IPA's Global Business Development Team. She covers IPA's East Africa country offices and leads media-related Salesforce efforts. Prior to joining IPA, Bianca works throughout North America and the Asia Pacific for organizations including Save the Children and the Red Cross, and brings a wide-ranging experience from training to business development to monitoring and evaluation to IPA. Bianca holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a master's degree in international development with a specialization in gender and development from the University of Melbourne in Australia. Our final presenter is Nkechi Owo, and she is an associate professor of economics at the University of Ghana. She's also a research associate with the Ghana node of the African Center of Excellence on Inequality Research, and a senior research fellow at the Environment for Development Institute. She also functions as a research fellow at the Partnership of Economic Policy in Nairobi, Kenya, and is currently a consultant at the World Bank Development Economics Research Group in Washington, DC. Although her research specialization is in health and demographic economics, she's also interested in research themes around poverty and inequality, environmental sustainability, and other macroeconomic issues in developing countries. I'll invite Ethan and Claire to start off the presentations. Thank you all for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Shivami. Thanks everyone for being here. As Shivami said, I'm Claire Hoffner. I'm the Education and Training Manager at JPAL Africa. And I'm presenting along with my colleague, Eitan Paul, from our JPAL Global Office. I'm going to jump in. I'm presenting the first set of slides, and then Eitan will take over in the second half. So what we're going to talk about is giving some guidelines about how to structure a strong proposal. I'll note that we focus primarily on proposals for randomized evaluations, or RCTs, as that's what JPAL funds, as well as exploratory work that will lead to an RCT. But many of the points apply to other forms of proposals for other types of impact evaluations, And we will highlight along the way points that where they differ for other types of proposals. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll go through some pre-proposal planning, kind of things you need to think about before you start writing the proposal. We'll then move on to setting the scene, which is where you're really motivating for the project, why it's interesting and why somebody should fund it. The next section we'll talk about is how you would describe the intervention. Then number 4, we'll get to the methodology, how you would describe your research design, etc. And we'll end off with how you would talk about the implementing partner and the research team in your proposal. Thank you. Next slide. So before we dive into the details of these steps and components, I just wanted to give an overview of what a grant proposal should include overall. Different funding initiatives and organizations have different templates or sections for their proposal, and that's true even within JPAL. But all proposals should answer these broad questions. And so we recommend that you, as you're writing a proposal, whether it's for us, IPA, or someone else entirely, that you come back to these questions and you just check, is your proposal answering these questions? So first of all is the what. What is your research question? What is new, or in other words, what's your contribution to the literature? And what are your expected findings? What kind of results do you expect to find? You may not find them, but you should be coming in with an expectation of what you'll find. Next is why. Why is the question interesting? You know, in particular, why do you think others will want to read your evaluation findings, right? It can't just be interesting to you. It needs to be interesting to funders, the academic audience, in JPAL's case, hopefully also the policy audience. Why is the answer consequential, or why does it matter? What impact might knowing that answer have in the real world? And again, this is particularly important to JPAL as we prioritize both academic innovation. So is it cutting edge research, but also is it relevant to real world, having an impact in the real world? And lastly, why isn't the answer obvious? And then how will you collect the data? Will it be through surveys, admin data, or both? How will you proceed with the empirical strategy? So how will your research design answer the question that you're posing? And then finally, in the case where you're submitting a proposal for exploratory work that will hopefully lead to an RCT, but is not yet an RCT, how will this exploratory work lead to that RCT? What information will it allow you to gather, and how will that inform the design and implementation of the full RCT? Next slide, please. All right, so let's just go through some pre-proposal planning. So checking out some things and getting information before you commit to actually writing the proposal. Next slide. Okay, so first of all, eligibility. To ensure the project and the research team are a good fit for the grant, it's really important that you check the eligibility requirements and the selection criteria. Funders will have clear guidelines on who is and isn't eligible to apply for their funding, based on a number of things. Could be the qualifications of the research team, their institutional affiliation, the location of the research team, etc. So depending on the funder, there'll be a number of different kind of criteria that you need to meet in order to be eligible for the funding. And I would say usually this is provided clearly online. It's certainly JPAL, we do our best to make that the case. But if it's not, don't hesitate to get in touch with the funder to find out this information. You're saving both yourself and the funder a lot of time and effort in the case that you're not eligible for a particular grant. Secondly, think about the priority match. So it's really important that you make sure that you understand the priorities of the funder. So is your topic within their thematic focus? Is your project in a priority region or country? And even just taking a step back from priority, certainly within JPAL, some of our funds will be specifically targeted at specific countries or regions, and other regions will be ineligible. So check that. And is the research question something they're interested in funding? So yeah, JPAL, at least I can speak to JPAL. We do quite a good job of providing documentation to say explicitly, in the labor sector, we are interested in these kinds of questions. And so we strongly recommend that you look at that and make sure that you are suggesting a question the funder wants to fund. And then finally, might be an obvious point, but just check on the deadlines, particularly because in some cases, funders will have multiple stages with multiple deadlines. In JPAL's case, you would submit a letter of interest initially. So we'd announce an RFP, you'd have about 4 to 6 weeks to submit a letter of interest, and then you'll get notified if you're approved to submit a full proposal, which you would have another 6 weeks or so to provide. So it's just to note that there could be multiple deadlines, and we recommend that you are very clearly aware of what they are. All right, next slide, please. So for JPAL and other bodies funding randomized evaluations, such as IPA, it's imperative that there's a clear pathway to a randomized control trial for the study you're proposing. So we do have these exploratory grants, and in how life works is sometimes you may discover that you cannot do a full RCT because, say, you find implementation of the program is not yet reliable enough or take-up is too low. But the plan and intention that you have for that exploratory work must always be that it could, or you hope that it will lead to a full RCT, and that needs to be very clear in your proposal. So we recommend strongly that that is clear in your mind before you submit any kind of proposal to JPAL. And so if you click to the next point, so for example, what this means, it means quite a few things, but just for example, your study must be proposing to evaluate a new program, either new in its design or in its reach or scope. So it must be new in some way so that there is a sufficiently large population that has never been exposed to it before in order to make a control group possible. So if the program is going to be delivered at scale, it's reaching everyone, there's no control group, or the program has already started, it cannot be evaluated with an RCT. And just to be clear, there are obviously many programs that are worth evaluating that fall into this category. They're already at scale, it's not a new program, etc. These are programs 100% worth evaluating in many cases, but they cannot be evaluated with an RCT. And so in JPAL's case, you would not submit a proposal to us to evaluate it because we would not be able to fund it. All right, next slide, please. And then before committing to write a proposal, we also advise that you check on the approvals you'll need to conduct the research. So this means contacting your university's office for grants to find out if the approval process, find out what that process is and what the deadlines are. Sometimes approvals are needed before you submit a proposal, depending on your organization. In other cases, you may only need them a bit later if you've actually been notified that you've been successful. And then partners in the lead institution will typically want to review your budget and your planned activities in advance. So be sure to account for this in your grant preparation timeline. And so we can give experience from our organization. So for example, MIT would require a minimum of 5 business days to be able to provide full and comprehensive proposal review, approval, and submission. So it's just to find out from your own institution what is required. And then if you could just click to the next point, we strongly recommend, hence the orange bold text, that you be conservative when estimating these timelines. Almost without fail, these steps will take longer than you anticipate, and if miscalculated, this can sometimes endanger the viability of your project. And I know that this is certainly true in terms of getting ethics approval or an IRB approval for your project. There are often delays. I know in some countries you need IRB approval from your university, from the country. There's a national board, and then you also need it from, say, a foreign university. So be sure that you know what those are, those steps, and then they tell you it takes a month, times it by 3. I'm talking vaguely here, but to give you an idea, be very conservative when you're estimating these things. All right. Your proposal will need to include letters of support from any close partners that you're working with. So this would be implementers in the case, we're talking about RCT, so a program is being implemented. And also any organization that receives a sub-award. So we give you money and you're going to give some of that money to the data collection firm, for example. That's a close partner. That's how we would define a close partner, and you would need a letter of support from them. To note, however, this does not include consultants or contractors if they do a narrow role. And furthermore, in the case of JPAL's smallest exploratory grant, which we call a proposal development grant, you wouldn't need letters of support because in our case, we give out these grants often for people to develop the relationship in the first place. But if you're applying for a larger grant called a pilot or a full RCT, you definitely need letters of support. And the reason they're so important is that they demonstrate the feasibility of the project. If you've got buy-in, then there's a strong chance that the project will go ahead. And reviewers, there are a number of things reviewers are looking for to be indicated in the proposal, and one of them is this feasible? Is it actually going to be able to be implemented? And if you just click to the next point. So some ideas for ways to demonstrate feasibility include a letter of support or formal agreement, or MOU, memorandum of understanding, with your implementing partner, the company responsible for data collection, and then any other organization playing an important role in either delivering the program or conducting the evaluation. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'd like to talk you through sort of what I've called setting the scene. So motivating for your study, laying out what you want to do and how it's going to contribute to the literature. So your proposal should always begin with a clear problem statement that motivates the research. It sets the scene by describing the challenges that the intervention is seeking to address, and it should be succinct and to the point. So for example, we've taken an example from a real proposal from actually Eitan Paul, who you're going to hear from shortly. You could click to show it now. Alicia? There we go. So Eitan begins as a proposal for a pilot. This pilot was titled Women's Empowerment and Local Governance in Indonesia, with the following. Women's interests remain underrepresented in local policy making, despite the implementation of community-based and participatory planning and budgeting programs in much of the developing world. Male dominance in neighborhood institutions may make it difficult for women's voices to be heard, even if female attendance quotas in village planning and budgeting meetings are met. So I think this is a great example. It really makes it clear what the problem is in this particular context and the consequences of that problem. And what I want to add here is, although here we've just provided the initial problem statement, in your proposal, the contextual factors that motivate the intervention should be supported by data and findings from prior research, that could include statistics from government agencies and prior research conducted by research team members. So you're providing the problem statement, but you do need to back it up with some kind of hard statistics. All right, so for your research question, you've now provided the motivation for the study. You would then go on to directly state your question and show how it fits into the literature and the field. So you need to make sure that the question should be understandable and compelling to researchers both within and outside of your discipline, and if applicable, ideally, to the policy community. It should be narrow and specific enough to answer with your proposed project, and should also clearly fit in with the request for proposal scope of work. So that again speaks to that point that your funder will have a specific agenda or topics it wants to fund, and you need to make sure your research question is a genuine fit for that scope and also is phrased in a way that indicates it's a fit for that scope. So if you click to the next point, again, taking from Eitan's proposal, his research question is, can trainings on women's empowerment and gender inclusion for, first of all, neighborhood level women's groups, and second of all, neighborhood association leaders, increase women's participation and representation in Indonesian neighborhoods? I think that's nice and clear where it is, what they're trying to, what's being tried to achieve, and sort of concisely saying what the question is. All right, and then in terms of contribution to the literature, so as you would do with an academic paper, a literature review and a grant proposal is there to contextualize your research and to show that your proposed study fills an important gap. And so you would do this by showing that you know the relevant literature on your study's topic, by citing important papers, and stating explicitly where the gaps are and how your study will fill them. It's really important, hence the colored text, not to disparage prior research. So don't go into it saying they got it wrong and here's where I get it right. Rather, you would highlight the ways in which your research will extend or complement existing work. So to be clear, sometimes it has been gotten wrong in the past, but you would not approach it with that. That may not be the case. And even if it is the case, you wouldn't approach it with that. You would just talk about how your work will build on what's already known. And then I want to say a literature review is important. You wouldn't ever skip it, but you should not spend the bulk of your proposal on the section. It should be concise. It does not need to be exhaustive. So it's achieving a similar goal to an academic paper, but it is not as in-depth as an academic paper's literature review. So you should aim for something between half a page and a page, depending on the maximum length of the whole proposal, which is something the funder will stipulate. Sources that you can draw on, kind of similar to in an academic paper, peer-reviewed journals, working paper series, reputable think tanks, research organizations, etc., are all kind of good sources for this. But I also want to stress, only include relevant studies. So studies that seek to answer the same or similar questions to your study, even if they were conducted in a different location. So don't get hung up on that question was done in India and mine's in Africa. If the question is the same, it's potentially relevant. Or papers that provide support for your theory or methodology. And if the intervention and design, it is the intervention and research design and not your discussion of others' research work that should be the focus of your proposal. All right, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Eitan at this point.
Great. So I realize we're basically at time, so maybe I'll just highlight a couple high-level things here, and then happy to go more in depth in the Q&A. So if you can go to the next slide. For the intervention, the treatment itself, you want to be as specific and detailed as possible within the limits of any space constraints in terms of how the treatment, or if there's multiple substantive treatment arms, what those will entail. And you want to provide evidence that will give the funder confidence in the feasibility by showing what specifically, how the treatment's going to be done, where it's going to be done, who's going to be doing it. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, you can go on. You also want to talk about the theory of change. So not just we expect this treatment to affect these outcomes in this way, but how do you expect it to do that? Through what mechanisms? And you may want to describe ways of collecting data also to try to assess and evaluate mechanisms that may be at play. You can move on So for the experimental design, this is important to present pretty specifically in terms of what the treatment arms will entail, the sample size for each treatment arm, and the level of randomization as well as the level of analysis. So for example, if it's like an education intervention where you're interested in student performance, you might need to do the randomization at the classroom level or the school level, and this will have implications for the power calculations. Can move on. Great, you'll want to also describe specifically the type of randomization that will be used. I'll make a plug for JPAL's research resources on our website that offer a lot of free information. It's basically like an online open textbook on how to design and run randomized evaluations, and particularly on things like randomization and power calculations, which you'll want to reference in your grant proposal. We have more information you can look up there. Move on. So outcomes, hypotheses, and mechanisms, as Claire alluded to, you want to be specific about how you're going to measure your outcomes, what will the data sources be, and what are your specific hypotheses? How do you expect that the treatment will affect each main outcome measure that you'll observe? And you'll want to provide a timeline. For example, how long after the treatment is implemented will you have an end-line survey or administrative data collection? Will there be a midline survey or other kind of data collection? I can move on. So power calculations are generally required for all RCT proposals, and they're going to need to include what the minimum detectable effects are for the sample size, and these other components. I think we can share the slides afterwards, and this is also something we have more resources on, so you can move on. And lastly, we wanted to highlight the importance of describing your implementing partners and their qualifications and relevant experience. So this could be like an NGO or a government agency that will be delivering the treatment, but also if you're partnering with a survey or other data collection firm to collect outcome data or run a baseline endline survey, you'll want to mention who they are and what their experience is. And also particularly, you can go to the next slide, in the case of earlier career researchers or researchers that have less experience with RCTs, you'll want to highlight whatever relevant experience you do have to give the funder more confidence in your ability to carry out the research you describe. Great, thanks so much, and happy to go more into detail on any of this in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire and Ethan, for that great presentation. I took quite a bit myself about trying to identify the clear pathways when you're writing a proposal to an RCT in the future as well, and the process for thinking through approvals, IRB approvals, and making sure you have a conservative timeline as well. So thank you very much for your presentation. Next, we have Mastering Grant Proposal Writing, Common Mistakes and How to Fix Them with Rachel and Bianca, who would share some open calls at the end too. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. As Shivani said at the beginning, I'm Rachel Steinecker, Director of Program Business Development at IPA. And today I'll be sharing some common mistakes that we see in research proposals and tips on how you can fix them. We'll be touching on 4 core themes. First, how well your proposal aligns with the request for proposals you're considering and the donor interest. Second, whether the appropriate intellectual leadership has been demonstrated in the proposal. Third, some common issues we see in the actual language and content of the proposals. And finally, some financial and coordination considerations you should keep in mind for a strong proposal. Okay, so let's start with some common mistakes we see in how well or poorly a proposal might align with a particular funding call. And some of these themes will be similar to what you heard Claire mention during her section, which is great. You can see, the same information coming from the same sources, from different sources. So first, the first mistake we often see is a lot of proposals that don't pay close enough attention to what the RFP is actually looking for and what the donor's end goals are. So what we mean by that is someone has read an RFP, so an open funding call, gotten really excited and thinks their project could be a great fit, but then you actually read it again more closely and come to understand the donor's really looking for something else, maybe a slightly different research topic to be investigated, maybe a different methodology to be used, maybe a different output. So a common one is maybe they're really only interested in using the results of study for program improvement and don't have a lot of interest in an academic publication, or vice versa. So you might have a great project idea, but you're unlikely to get funded if it's not well aligned with what the donor actually wants to fund. So pay attention to the very specific language they use and try really to understand at a deeper level what they're interested in. It often takes several reads to really understand what they want. I've read hundreds of RFPs in my life, and I always read them several times to really try to get my head wrapped around what they're looking for. And also try to gauge what they're interested in, whether they're interested in more academically focused studies, policy-oriented studies, program design activities, by reading through their website and then also looking at studies that the donor has previously studied or funded. If you're working with IPA, our business development team and our country directors can also help provide this information to you. Next issue what we often see is teams trying to contort their project idea to be eligible for an RFP. So in this case, your team has fully understood what the donor is looking for and that your project isn't a perfect fit, but you try to squeeze your project to fit into the donor's interest, even though it's not aligned. So an example is maybe your funder is looking for a project on your topic of interest, but they require a really deep government partnership and your team doesn't have one. So you try to quickly get a letter of support from a ministry so you can be eligible, and then you'll plan to figure out and develop that relationship further once you get funded. The donor will almost certainly figure out pretty quickly that it's not actually a deep partnership yet. And it's unlikely that you'll win. And even if you do win, both you and the donor will probably end up unhappy because neither are actually doing quite what they hoped for or intended. So fixes, look for other funding sources for your project idea, or even consider a new project idea for your RFP that you're interested in. Also, again, feel free to reach out to IPA's country directors to discuss your ideas and potential opportunities, because we can also talk about ways to, work together to pursue potential funding opportunities together that might be more aligned. Next theme, intellectual leadership for project proposals. The first issue we often see is teams not demonstrating an LMIC PI's substantive participation in the study or the significance of their contributions. So donors who express interest in LMIC PIs are looking for clear indicators that the LMIC PI will be substantively involved in the project. And many submissions don't effectively highlight the unique experience that LMIC PIs bring. Fix. Ensure that you clearly explain the unique contributions of yourself and other LMIC PIs on the project. For example, having a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of the local context, having relationships with policymakers. And second, demonstrate specifically where you'll be contributing to the project and how. For example, maybe your project requires working closely with the Ministry of Education and requires frequent in-person visits or meetings that you'll lead. Or maybe you have a lot of experience conducting RCTs and you'll be leading that element of the study. Make sure you highlight where you're going to be contributing directly to the project. Next issue we see is a lot of proposals not including a principal investigator who's focused on the study design and really experienced with the methodological approach being proposed. So you might have one or two great, really smart researchers on the project, but no one who has experience actually running the type of research you've proposed. Maybe you've been trained in it, learned a lot about it, you know how to run it, but you just haven't run it before. Donors are really sensitive to this and will be reviewing the experience of all of the team members when they're deciding whether to fund a project or not. So a fix for this is, for example, if you're proposing to run an RCT in your project and you're really well trained in RCT methodologies, but this is your first time actually running an RCT, you should strongly consider bringing on an additional PI to the team who has experience doing this. This isn't to say you won't have intellectual leadership on the study, but rather it ensures the confidence in the donor that the actual implementation is practically feasible and will go as smoothly as possible. It's also a great professional development opportunity for you, as you'll get free hands-on training and implementing a methodology that maybe you haven't had the opportunity to implement before. So now into proposal content. First issue we often see is research teams not telling the donor what you're actually going to do until the end of the introduction. So we don't actually see the statement of the purpose of the project until we reach the end of the first paragraph, or sometimes we don't even see it until the end of the first section. Fix, start with a purpose statement. Your very first 1 to 2 sentences right off the bat should be outlining what you intend to do. So don't leap directly into providing background information and contextual analysis. A lot of proposals make this mistake. A good example of what to include is something like the following as your very first sentence in your proposal. So like the very first thing you write down. Researchers at the University of Nairobi aim to support the Kenyan government to promote the growth of female-owned businesses by conducting a large-scale randomized control trial, exploring the role of inter-household bargaining on the take-up, usage, and effects of business loans on female-owned businesses. After you've made that statement of what it is you're intending to do, then proceed to give more information about the gravity and relevance of the issue and more context. Next issue we see is many proposals don't include a clear explanation on how the research findings will be used, including clear next steps on the path to scale if that's relevant and something the donor's looking for. So donors are increasingly demanding this. Simply just publishing an academic publication is often not considered sufficient project output by many funders. A fix, you include a clear outline of why the study results would be relevant in the field and how the results could be used. For example, maybe you're trying to fill an evidence gap in the academic literature. Maybe you're trying to inform the actions of local policymakers. Include this in both your purpose statement, as well as providing a more detailed outline of the concrete steps you'll take later in the proposal, usually in a section called dissemination or take up, something like that. Next one we see, and Claire alluded to this as well, we often see a lot of very beautifully written, we can switch to the next slide. We often see a lot of very beautifully written, long introductions, background sections, great contextual analysis, but they take up the bulk of the application, and there's a lot less attention being paid to the actual design of the study. So these don't need to be comprehensive. The best fix is You need to include a detailed methodological approach, including the reasoning behind the selected approach. I know Etienne covered quickly some different aspects that you can cover that you should make sure to highlight in your research methodology. I would really advise going back and taking a close look at those slides, because really spelling out your details of how you're planning to approach it and what you're planning to do, power calculations, you know, how you're going to be doing your randomization, et cetera, is really essential. So yeah, I would strongly recommend going back and taking a look at that. Next, financial, administrative, and coordination considerations. So many research teams, and I mean, I've fallen into this trap as well, many research teams don't leave enough time to get the budget put together, and it's really quickly put together at the last minute of proposal development. We also see things like researchers doing things like increasing the scope of work in the proposal without having the implementing partner or research organization rebudget, assuming that there's probably enough budget or buffer in the budget to allow for those changes. Your project idea might be great, but if it's poorly budgeted, both you and your partners might end up in a situation where you're unable to actually implement the scope of work that you've agreed upon with the donor, which will end up being a really big problem in the end. Fix, the researchers, implementing partner, and research implementing partner need to work together to develop and agree on the planned scope of work very early. This really should be the first thing that you figure out. Second, agreeing the maximum cost of the project and what funding allocations will be made for each team. So maybe it's, you know, 20,000 for researcher time over a couple of years, 200,000 for program implementation, 500,000 for the RCT, but decide what is going to who. And all partners need to prepare draft budgets to ensure they can actually conduct the scope of work that they're signing up for within their funding allocation. If it's not possible, you then need to go back and negotiate and adjust your scope of work so that it fits in something that's feasible within the funding envelope. And lastly, a very common issue we see is teams not leaving enough time to get the entire proposal submission package together. So oftentimes proposals involve a lot more than just the narrative that you're putting together. There'll be different annexes. Obviously, you'll have the budget, letters of support. If the application is incomplete, your proposal may be rejected without even being read by the donor. So fix, the best solution is to leave enough time to prepare your complete submission package. I know that's easier said than done. If you're working with IPA, we will provide you with a compliance matrix, which basically outlines all of the required elements of the submission, all of the different deadlines and draft deadlines, assignments of who will be working on what, and everything will be due a minimum of 48 hours before the donor's deadline, which really helps with keeping things organized. I'd say if you aren't working with IPA, try doing the same. So go through, read through everything that's required, look at the timeline, and really map out when you need your different drafts done, who's going to be doing what, so that you can keep yourself on track to make sure that it's done within 48 hours before the donor deadline, and you have time to then review and make sure that you, if you're missing anything, you have time to get it done at the last minute. All right, so I know we went through that really quickly. I hope you found this discussion useful. We're always happy to help and discuss this with you further. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and feel free to reach out to our team afterwards as well. We're always happy to chat after the webinar as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that amazing presentation. We'll now hand it over to Bianca to go over a few open calls, give you a few tips for your next application. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Suomi and Rachel. Some really useful advice there on common mistakes by Rachel. And you can go to the next slide as well. Oh, sorry, the previous one. So, no, the one before that, sorry. Yeah, we'll just leave it here. But as previously mentioned, I'm Bianca, Senior Program Development Associate at IPA, and I'll now be taking you through a few more business development related topics, including JPL's African Scholars Program, donors that are openly seeking LMIC researchers, potential funding opportunities that are currently open from those donors, and how to know when to go for a PFO and whether it's a good fit or not. So I'll be starting off with JPAL's African Scholars Program, if you're not already familiar with it, and you can keep it on that previous slide, Sabrina. Thanks. If you're not already familiar with it, JPAL's African Scholars Program, or ASP, is a program that provides funding, mentorship, and training opportunities to African researchers. Some background context on this is that JPAL Africa launched its ASP program in 2019, and since then has initiated 32 African scholar projects led by 65 African scholars in 11 countries. My apologies for any unexpected acronyms there. But to date, over 800K has been allocated to research programs across JPAL's research initiatives within this program. But first, the African Scholars Program provides access to JPAL funding to conduct RCTs. There are 3 types of funding JPAL provides under 4 initiatives. We'll get into the initiatives in the next slide, but just a quick breakdown of the funding and their budget caps as listed to the left on the slide here. For formative research, there are 2 subgroups of funding. And the first is for any proposal development grants, which is up to 10K. The second subgroup for formative research is for pilot grants, which are up to 75K. And monitoring systems, and keep in mind that this is only for the Digify initiative that I'll describe later on in this presentation, is up to 75K. And last but not least, up to 400K of funding is available for full randomized development. So African scholars who are funded are then matched with a JPAL affiliate or an invited researcher as a mentor. So the mentors advise about the research design and implementation, as well as provide guidance, and the PI teams may gain access to the mentor networks as well. One quick thing to note is that the mentor does not have to be a co-author, and if the PI team and mentor agree on that, it's fine. But it's not an expectation. Support is also provided by JPAL staff during the application process through calls with the research teams where questions and clarifications on the LOI are addressed before proceeding to submitting a full proposal, as well as training and capacity building, which is provided through online courses, as well as webinars on specific topics like proposal writing and training to increase their knowledge of RCTs. And just the overall goal of all of this and the hope is that all proposals funded will then lead to full RCTs. So staff have that ongoing support after the project is done to facilitate this as well. And if you want to know a little more about the ASP program, the slide does include the links to all of these opportunities, initiatives, and just the program in general. So once you receive this slideshow after this call, you can go ahead and click on those links there. But so yeah, as previously mentioned, there are 4 initiatives. Sorry, you can keep it on the previous slide. There are 4 initiatives that are covered by JPAL's African Scholars Program. There's the Digital Agricultural Innovations and Services Call, also known as DAISY, the Digital Identification and Finance Initiative, or Digify, the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative, or JOY, and the newest one, which is the Learning for All Initiative. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of each of these given the time, as well as given that their titles are a pretty good indicator of each research area. But again, if you want to learn more, feel free to click on those links once this PowerPoint is shared with you. And then there's just one thing I also did want to point out is out of these 4, Digify is the only call that's technically open at the moment since they're accepting proposals on a rolling basis. But the other initiatives tend to have more than one funding round a year, so do be on the lookout for their upcoming rounds. Next slide, please. So in terms of eligibility to be an African scholar, JPAL funds these 2 categories here. So for African scholars, you have to have completed a PhD in economics and be based at an academic institution in Africa. So this would be, if you have these 2 characteristics, you can apply under this category here. Non-resident African scholars are those who completed high school in Africa, have earned their PhD in economics, and are based at an academic institution outside of Africa. So a couple of things to clarify here before moving forward is that when we say academic institution, here it means universities only, so think tanks do not apply, unfortunately. And secondly, only one member of the team needs to meet this definition of African scholar. So just to keep that in mind for these state calls. Thank you, Subhumi. So over recent years, the inclusion of LMIC PIs has become more and more important to donors. And we're seeing that this trend is likely to spread to other donors over time, especially over the next few years. So while you can term almost every donor as pro LMIC, at this point, there are some donors that explicitly state the need for a local PI, or at least highly encourage it for a proposal to even be considered for funding. So for example, the International Development Research Center, IDRC, and the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, SVRI, are a couple of examples of donors who actually explicitly require that an LMIC PI be on the research team. While there are other examples that strongly encourage it within their RFPs, like for example, our IPA intimate partner violence and PNR calls at IPA, as well as the Mercury project. Just one other thing to note for these donors here, that the donors listed on this slide are just a few examples, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. Next slide, please. So for the sake of time, I know we are a tiny bit over. I'm just going to speed through these 4 calls that are currently open for some of the donors from the previous slide. But again, feel free to check out these links for more information if you receive this PowerPoint. But this is the first one, and there are 2 IDRC opportunities listed in the next 4 that I'm going to be showing. And keep in mind that for IDRC, the more locally influenced the proposal is, the better and more attractive it is to the donor. And this includes incorporating local LMIC PIs. So for this one here, this is the Knowledge and Innovation for Strengthened Education Data Systems and Data Use call from IDRC. The deadline is coming up, it's July 17th, and you'll see the different funding caps for the different funding categories they have listed here. Please feel free to check this out in case that is of interest, but also feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in this one, because this is a bit tricky given the different funding categories. Next slide. And so this one is IPA's Displaced Livelihoods Initiative with a funding cap of $500K. The deadline is July 21st. And just in terms of the LMIC PI requirement, it's again not an explicit requirement, but IPA does highly encourage proposals from teams with researchers or other research team members with lived experiences related to the topic. And we also encourage prospective applicants to consider working both across disciplines and with researchers from the countries where the project will take place. Next slide. So this call is UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation Medical Research Council's call for applied global health research. The deadline for this is August 1st, and the funding cap is at $2 million. And just in terms of the LMIC PI requirement here, again, not a requirement, but it is highly encouraged by MRC for applications from overseas researchers that are based in LMICs and researchers who are eligible to apply for MRC. And this last one here is IDRC's Knowledge and Innovation for Achieving Gender Equality and Social Inclusion at School. The deadline for this is August 28th. Again, this one does have multiple funding caps here. And feel free to check out more information on all of these given the links after this is shared. Next slide, please. So lastly, I wanted to share this quick checklist that may help you determine whether you should go for a potential funding opportunity or not. This complements and echoes some of the proposal preparation steps in general that Claire had previously mentioned and went through earlier, and includes a few other considerations when working with IPA. And if you will be working with IPA, you'll of course have our help from the BD team when evaluating these things, as well as get that compliance matrix that Rachel had mentioned. So these things include alignment, which Claire had already touched on, funding size and budget. So just in general, you know, like, is the funding size even worth the pursuit in terms of what the project would be in terms of size and scope? And will the budget cover all costs while maintaining research quality? This also includes implementation, evaluation, partners, and other guidelines. So just in general, is everyone in line, and are we all trying to achieve the same goal that the PFO is achieving? So again, just given the time, I won't go through these in detail, but feel free to take a look at this further, and would be happy to answer any questions as well during the Q&A. Next slide. So again, as Rachel had mentioned before, if you have any questions regarding IPA or business or proposal development in general, you can reach out to us at this email here, pd@povertyaction.org. Thank you so much, and I hope you found this insightful.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for that presentation and for going through several open calls that will be of interest to the audience. If anyone has seen one that they think it would be useful for them to apply to, or interesting for them to collaborate with JPAL or IPA, like Bianca said at the end, please feel free to reach out to us with your ideas. We're more than willing to work with you. Great. So handing over to Nkechi Owo, who's our final presenter, and she will share some of her experiences going through the proposal writing stage and some of the lessons that she's learned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm pleased to talk about my experiences thus far with proposal writing. I have been a recipient of the JPAL African Scholars Program. So I have received funding for both of these. That's the Digify and also the Jobs and Opportunity Initiative. So even though I will be speaking about my experience with relation to these programs, I'm going to try to be as general as possible to include other funding opportunities I've also applied for with respect to my research on different types of impact evaluation. So this is the outline that my presentation or my submission will take. I will talk about my experiences as it relates to how to find open calls and select the most suitable ones to respond to. I'll also talk about my experiences or some of my strategies that I have adopted in trying to structure a strong proposal in response to some of these calls. And I'll touch also on some of the common mistakes, recommended actions as it applies to my experiences thus far. So with respect to how to find open calls, so for me, I have found that it has been useful to join different mailing lists, organizations' mailing lists, because I find that when you sign up to, be added to an organization's mailing list, a research institute's mailing list, oftentimes they are able to disseminate information about potential grant opportunities that you can have access to and then respond to. So an example, for example, if you go to the IPA's website, I know that there's this option to sign up for a newsletter. So this is something that I have found useful to do because then you are kept in the loop about different opportunities that may come up with respect to certain calls for proposals. It's also an important strategy I have found to join different professional associations. So in my line of work, I am a demographic economist. So I'm a member of the IUSSP, the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. I also do some work on gender studies. So I'm a part of AWI and IAFI as well. So I found that if you join some of these professional networks, again, they are often in the habit of circulating opportunities that one can get access to and respond to. I am also a JPAL invited researcher. This is another way I have found is important for finding or receiving information on open calls for proposals. Now, with respect to becoming an invited researcher for JPAL, there are two ways that this can happen. So you can be nominated and then go through an intense selection process. And hopefully if you come out successful, then you are given the opportunity to become an invited researcher. But there's also an option for self-nomination. JPAL affiliates are, I would describe as more senior affiliates of JPAL who have had a lot more experience with carrying out RCTs, impact evaluations. To become a JPAL affiliate, you also go through a very rigorous selection process. But the benefit of this is, again, you are given ready access to opportunities to put in applications for certain grants that become available. I think that it's also important when we think about, getting access to some of these calls, not to underestimate the importance of your research networks. It's important to keep in touch, talk to people in your research network. When you go to conferences, discuss your work, indicate an interest in, for example, applying for certain opportunities, and then, you're able to get access to some of these calls that are circulating in the space that you might respond to. I think that one other way that has been useful for me is by attending in-person programs at IPA country offices. So this is how we actually got, my team and I got the information about the Digify program in Ghana. We had attended a program that was being organized by IPA in the country, and they told us about this open call for proposals. And afterwards, we got together and decided that it was something we're interested in actually responding to. So I'm sure that since it happens in Ghana, it's probably something that also happens in other countries as well. So you should definitely keep an eye to the ground on some of these announcements, and then definitely attend some of these programs so you can learn more about the opportunities and then how to respond adequately to them. I know that some people are of the view that social media may not be a very effective way of spending one's time, but I have found that certain platforms like LinkedIn and Twitter have surprisingly good information on funding calls. So another more targeted approach may be to try to follow some of these organizations on Twitter, like JPAL, IPA. They also have LinkedIn accounts as well, so that when they are open calls, you may have access to this because you are on they're on your radar, and then you are following some of these announcements. With respect to how to select the most suitable calls to respond to, I think that for me, the first thing has been your interest in the subject matter. So a lot of these calls oftentimes will focus on, certain themes, in agriculture, gender, climate change, jobs and employment, education. So I think the first thing is you want to make sure that you are responding to a call that is going to be of interest to you. Some of these calls last, between a year, as long as, 2 years, 3 years, even 5 years. You want to make sure that if you are committing your time to some of these projects, assuming you are successful with the proposal, it's something that will hold your interest over a long period of time. So it's important that first you are interested in the theme that is being advertised. And then you also want to think about your availability to put the proposal together, and if successful, carry out the work. So I work at the University of Ghana. I have a full teaching load. I have supervision responsibilities. I have service responsibilities to my department, to the university. And if you are from a university that is like mine, there's not the option to buy out your teaching time. You can't say that because you are on a project or putting together a proposal, you should be excused from certain teaching responsibilities or other responsibilities. So I think that in selecting suitable calls, you want to first make sure that you have the time to put this proposal together, to be able to see it through to the end, and then if successful, carry out the work. The last thing you want is to put in an application for proposal, be successful, and then be frustrated with respect to carrying out the work or delivering high quality outputs because you don't have the time. So that's an important consideration. And then you want to also think about yours and your team's strengths. So if you have an existing research group with the requisite skills needed to respond to the call, that is great. You want to make sure that, there's somebody who's able to, work on the methodology, who's good with literature review, with analysis, stakeholder engagement, all of that. And this is where, even if in your core team, you are not able to find people who may be able to be ideally placed for some of these aspects to respond to the call, this is where you want to rely on a broader research network. So again, it's important to emphasize that as researchers, we pay attention to, building a solid research network, because you may not know when, somebody you spoke to at a conference or somebody you met during a webinar or whatever might become a critical addition to a call that you want to respond to. I think that in responding to some of these calls, some interventions tend to be quite expensive and they are not always covered by the funder. So when you are trying to look for suitable calls to respond to, if you have access to a partner that's already active in the space, you want to evaluate a program or an intervention, that is also useful because it likely brings down, the cost of your project, and it's already something that is underway or going on the ground. I think that there are other requirements of the call to keep in mind, and I think that some of these have already been touched on by the earlier presenters. Sometimes some of the calls require collaborators from the global north. You have to consider if you are able to get these in place. Some of these calls also have very strict reporting requirements. The number of reports you have to submit in a year, again, taking into account some of your other responsibilities, you have to be able to gauge whether you are able to respond adequately to these. Some of these require, stakeholder meetings, conferences to disseminate the work. They require that you include graduate students or young researchers and provide mentoring opportunities for them. Some of them are also quite clear on the number of publications or other reports or research outputs you are supposed to deliver on. So when you are thinking about selecting the most suitable ones, these are certain things you have to keep in mind, just so that if you are successful, you are actually able to deliver on the requirements of the call. I do have a few points or strategies that I have found useful in putting together a strong proposal. Some of these have already been touched on, but I'm happy to reiterate because I think that they are important. So I think that in putting together a strong proposal, you want to do your own research to have a good understanding on what has already been done in the literature and what your potential contribution to existing knowledge will be. So on the Jobs and Opportunities Initiative, that's program that I received funding on, this was one of the considerations. I mean, the team in Ghana was aware of the fact that when you think about some factors that go into, successful business or good business performance, oftentimes a lot of interventions have focused, on, formal business training. We hadn't seen as much emphasis on the potential role of personal initiative training or the development of soft skills, if you will. So we thought that this was an area that would be important to touch on. It would contribute to the existing knowledge on some of the things that made businesses successful, particularly in our context. So I think it's important, first of all, to try to make a contribution to what is already known. I think that it's also important to state clearly what the theory of change is. And I think this came up in one of the earlier presentations. How is a given intervention or program expected to lead to a specific development change? And so with my proposals that I have developed, I found it useful to state, clearly exactly how I'm going to interrogate the potential channels of effect that I think will be important in moving from point A to point B. And I also try to clearly explain how these will be explored, even with the data collection processes. I've already talked about the importance of having an implementing partner already active in the space. As I mentioned before, interventions can be expensive. So if you already have somebody who's rolling out a program and you are coming in to sort of try to evaluate this, it will at least be more cost effective. And then one way to make this, make it into a strong proposal is to have a letter of support. This came up earlier, or at least some evidence of commitment from the implementing partner, so that the funder sees that there will be no hitches from that angle. I think that it's also becoming very important to show the cost effectiveness of certain interventions. And I think it also improves the potential for scale up. So even for pilot projects, and these are the ones that I have been involved in, it's important to show that you won't need as much resources to be able to accomplish the outcomes that you are looking at. I think that it's also important to choose a strong team, came up earlier on again, with clear contributions of members. I had this experience earlier on where I was putting together a team of individuals to respond to a call. And one of my members had made a comment that perhaps to make the proposal stronger, we needed to include somebody from the global north. And I had asked that, okay, but what would that individual do? Because the current team already had everybody well positioned to respond to the call with respect to our strengths and our capacities. But the individual was of the view that, if you bring somebody from the global north, it would show greater experience or potential, I'm not sure. But it was a suggestion that always stuck with me, because it let me know that, this perception that, perhaps if you have, a team that is based predominantly from the global south, for some reason, it might cast some doubt on the capability, I'm not sure. But we stuck to the team that had been constituted. And I'm pleased to say that not only was our project successfully completed, we actually won the award for the best project from that institute for that year. So I think that in putting together team members, these should be selected based on merit, not on presumed perceptions of, how other people might perceive the team. We should be confident, in our own capabilities without needing to put other people on the team that may not contribute much, because they might actually lead to increased complications for the group. A few more points to keep in mind. I think that it's important that the project be feasible. Okay, so when you are putting together a proposal, don't talk about an intervention, for example, using smartphones in a region where it's well known has low internet connectivity or, doesn't have the relevant infrastructure. So you have to be aware of the local context and what is feasible. Otherwise, even if the funder is not aware that this intervention may not be successful, when you get the funding, it will be a challenge to deliver on what you said you can do. I think that even choosing the sites for your studies should also be carefully thought out. You don't want to say that you are going to go to an area which is known to be conflict-ridden, for example, because then funders may have concerns about your safety and ability to deliver on what you say you are able to do. Just a few other things to keep in mind. It's already come up. There should be sufficient time allowed for iterations from the team when you are putting together your proposal. So ideally, this is likely to be a team effort. So you want to make sure everybody comes together, makes their suggestions, and then you want to be able to take these into account in strengthening the proposal, but that would need to allow enough time so that the proposal process isn't rushed. You also want to make time to allow for feedback from your university. So in many cases, you need to have certain documents, certain approval from your university before you proceed. Allow enough time for that so you can meet the proposal deadlines. The other things to keep in mind, make sure that you are following instructions on word count, format, team composition. Sometimes they say you must have, maybe 50% gender parity. Sometimes they say that, you need certain members from different parts of the world. They say you need to include certain early career researchers, graduate students, all of that. Make sure that in responding to the proposal, if you want it to be strong enough to be successful, you take all of these as much as possible into account. I have a few points on, identifying common mistakes, recommended actions. I think the earlier speakers have already done a very good job of this, so I'll just talk quickly through this. I think that if you are involved, or if you are going to be involved in a project with an implementing partner, it's very important that expectations are stated clearly on both sides. This came up earlier on, especially with, issues relating with budgeting. Otherwise, you will find that, when you are halfway through the project, your implementing partner comes in and says that, oh, the expectation was they would get so much because without them, you couldn't be doing this project and all of that. And it can really destabilize the research. Or sometimes, you may need access to data from your implementing partner. If these are not clearly stated from the outset and the data is not forthcoming, it can present challenges. So you want to make sure that if you are working with an implementing partner, all of these things are stated, discussed clearly upfront. And I think that it's also important to talk about issues with budgeting. Already come up, so I won't spend too much time on this. I think that in putting together a budget for some of these calls for proposals, you want to make sure that to the extent that it is allowed, you leave room for some contingency. So maybe when you are done with the whole budgeting process, maybe 10% or so for contingency, because things can often change in the field, or you realize that you hadn't costed adequately for an intervention or something, or the economy could shift in a direction that all of the earlier estimates you made are somehow thrown, will become, you would need more funding for those same line items. So it's important to keep some contingency so that you are not left stranded if anything unexpected changes. I think another mistake. Yes. Time. Am I out of time? Hello?
Yes, please. We're getting to the end of your time. Thank you very much, Nkechi.
Okay. I will just 2 more minutes and then I should wrap up. So I think that while you shouldn't exaggerate your cost in putting together your budget, you also don't want to sabotage yourself with undercosting. Because if you say that you need a certain amount, that's the amount that's going to be granted. And if it turns out that you were simply trying to attract the grants by underestimating your cost, you will have to find a way to still carry out the project and deliver high quality because your reputation is attached to some of these outputs. You should also make sure that you allow enough time so that you don't delay with certain processes like ethics approval already been discussed. Cultivate good relationships with personnel in your research offices, in your different universities, because we are all aware that it's a human institution. So you want to be sure that at least when you're sending these responses, you are respectful, you are giving what is required, all of that. I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions after this.
Thank you so much, Nkechi, for your invaluable advice. It was really great to hear your experiences, what you think we should include in our proposals as well. And thank you again. So now we've come to the Q&A session. I know we have about 12 minutes left before the end of the webinar, but we want to take some time to answer some of the questions that you sent earlier on, as well as a few from the audience, if they have a couple of questions. Great. So I'll start off with a question for Claire. What are the primary organizations what are the primary steps organizations should take when initiating their grant-seeking endeavors?
Thanks, Romy. I'll probably just repeat kind of what I said at the beginning of my presentation. So we will share these slides, so you'll be able to look back at them. But it's really getting to grips with what, first understanding what you want to do, and then looking for requests for proposals and seeing if your project fits with what funders are looking to fund. And I think, as Rachel said, don't try and crowbar your project into an RFP if it isn't a good fit. That will be picked up. So it's either about really identifying one that does fit with what you want to do, or with maybe coming up with a new idea that fits a funder that you have found. Yeah, and then just checking eligibility requirements. I really want to stress that. Some people do waste some of their time applying or writing proposals when they don't meet some of the criteria. And funders really will generally be pretty clear about who and what is eligible and what's not. But I know I can speak for us at JPAL, and it's probably for any funder, that we're very responsive to email queries that come in asking about eligibility or sort of just general guidance on applying for funding. So I would say please do reach out to funders that you are considering applying to ask them for any kind of information or guidance that you need. I think I'll end there.
Okay. And then a question for Rachel is how to form research teams across regions and countries for writing proposals.
Sure, great. It's an excellent question. I would say definitely start by expanding your network of researchers well in advance before a funding call comes open. So what you don't want to do is wait until a really interesting funding call opens. You have a couple of weeks to put it together, and then you're starting to reach out to people and say, hey, are you interested in, do our research interests align? Are you interested in working on this with me? So you can start doing this by identifying other researchers who do similar or complementary work to what you do, by reading their publications, attending conferences, webinars, etc., and then just reaching out to them via email. Set up a time to discuss your ideas, see if your ideas align, if there might be potential for a collaboration in the future. I would really strongly recommend you do this, as I said, before a funding call opens, so that you know who you might have alignment with and where there might be synergies before you start to try to put together a proposal together. I would also strongly recommend, so if you're working with a research organization or research implementer, say like IPA, talking about your ideas, again, well in advance of calls coming open, because we can also help provide linkages to researchers who might be interested in your type of work or where there might be complementary research alignment. So I guess the moral of the story is start really early and try to expand your network of both with research organizations and researchers from the beginning.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. Question for Bianca is how do we identify suitable calls, how to prepare responsive proposals, and how do we manage the period after you submitted a proposal, where you're waiting feedback, maybe you get some comments as well. How do you manage that process?
Sure, thank you, Subhumi. So just in terms of identifying suitable and genuine calls, in addition to the guidance that everyone's provided in terms of preparing a strong proposal, from a BD standpoint, when proactively seeking suitable and genuine calls, make sure the RFP is up to date by checking directly on the donor website, rather than relying on, let's say, documents that are included on third-party funding websites, or at least double check the validity of those RFP documents by checking on the direct donor's website. And then in terms of preparing a responsive proposal, just bare basics there is carefully reading through the RFP and responding in the same structure that the RFP is structured. So if they give you a list of XYZ things to respond to, respond in that same structure of XYZ. And then just managing the post-proposal period. This is usually quite an exciting and anxious period for everyone. Within the RFP, usually donors will state there's a certain time frame of when they'll get back to you. Let's say it's a matter of weeks or months. And so, yeah, if they don't state that, usually you can just shoot them an email to see when you'll be able to hear back. But yeah, that's just a super basic response to that.
Thanks, Bianca. My last question for now is for the JPAL team, so Ethan or Claire. And the question was about why are some proposals rejected by funders? I think that was quite common.
I can jump in, sure. So at least with the JPAL review process, it's a peer review process where there are professors in the JPAL network from not just MIT universities all over who do their own research in related sectors to the proposal, and they review it similar to the review process for like submitting a journal article at a peer review journal. So I think a common reason is often kind of not following all the recommendations that we've given in the prior presentation. So in particular, if it's not clear what the research is trying to do, or how it will be achieved, or there aren't enough details about the experimental design or how outcomes will be measured, if any of that is not clear, that could be a reason for rejection. Or if it doesn't seem like it's going to be a unique or big enough contribution to the literature. So if you're proposing evaluating a type of program that there's already very good evidence that that program works because there've been RCTs done on it, in a similar context already, that could be a reason for rejection. So you want to try to do something that's clearly new, ideally will inform policy or an academic important question, and also is just very clearly laid out in terms of the motivation, the research design, and the details of the experimental design, outcome measurement, all of that, for it to be a strong proposal that's more likely to succeed.
Thank you very much, Ethan. I have one question for Nkechi, which I think she touched on as well, but people were curious to see how you form teams with researchers from the Global South and the North as well. It would be great to hear an example from you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that, as I mentioned before, and as the earlier speaker had said, it's important to, first of all, have a really good research network in place. And one way that I have done that is, oftentimes when I attend these international conference and meetings, I like to pay attention to what people's specialties are. So I will often send an email to have coffee or have a lunch meeting with people I think have research specializations or interests similar to mine. So even if I don't have necessarily a call that I'm wanting to respond to at the moment, it's important to have these individuals at least know what I'm working on, be aware of what they are working on, and then indicate an interest in collaborating in the future. Even if you don't attend some of these conferences as often as you would want to, we read a lot of journal articles. You are able to, and there's the contact information for individuals doing interesting research in areas that you are also interested in. So you can also reach out to these individuals, introduce yourself, and then have them be in your network. And then keep in mind that when you are trying to put together a team for, a research team, be it local or international, to respond to a grant, outside of these, you again shouldn't underestimate people in your faculty, in your universities, research institutions. These individuals may themselves be able to connect you with people who could be useful partners to, or useful people to partner with respect to putting together or constituting these research teams. So I think that this is where, building a good network becomes useful, because then you are able to quickly draw on these contacts and then, be able to respond to some of these calls. This has been useful, at least in my experience. Thank you.
So much, Nkechi. I'll pause here to allow for questions from the audience. Sebastiana's had a hand up, I think, the entire time, so I'll let Sebastiana speak first. Sebastiana, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hello. Actually,
hello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. My question is half answered, because when the last speaker was talking, he made mention of how individual could really go. But my question is, how can you get funding as a new researcher? You have a new team without having a professional partner among you. And you find out that most times these professionals, their demand or commission may be high for you to want to continue with the research. Is it possible to get funding without a professional partner in your research team? Thank you. Hello?
Okay, Sebastiana. So she had a question about getting funding without a professional partner. Would Rachel, Claire, like to take a stab at that?
I could also jump. So for JPAL, that could be a good use for a proposal development grant, where that can be used to help identify who partners could be. So that's kind of a form of a scoping grant where you would, have funding to travel and meet with prospective partners, do preliminary interviews to try to get a sense of who the appropriate partner could be.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Brasa, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So my name is Bethel Ketch from Kenya. I work with I'm a researcher and one of a co-director in one of the local organizations NGO in Kenya. So my question would be to the IPA team: do you normally fund systematic reviews?
That's an interesting question. I would, full, candor, systematic reviews don't tend to be something that are typically funded by IPA calls. That being said, they're not excluded. So I think if there's a really good argument for why a systematic review would respond to a call that we have open, and you can make a justification for it, certainly we're open to it. It's more typical for us to be funding things like RCTs or pilot work that leads up to an RCT or exploratory work that might lead to an RCT. But it's certainly not excluded.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha. Thank you, Rachel. Next, we have Zacchaeus. If you can, please introduce yourself and then kindly mention who your question is for. That would be great.
I really appreciate you. My name is Zacchaeus Oluwafemi, agri-economist specialist from Nigeria. I just want to add to the former question asked by the earlier person that has. So because when you want to form a new team, because that was what I was contemplating, what are the level of experience it is required? Can the team be from people that are maybe intermediate or early researcher, or some professor? Because I discovered that most of these professors, they always busy, they have work at hand. That is number one. Number two, the second question is about, can we have the platform for training? Because that is where I think from the experience of the speaker, one of the speakers said that from the training, you can interact, have a different background. Can this IPR give us that platform to come for on-site training? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Zacchaeus. If I understood his question correctly, the last portion, it's about if there's possibility of on-site training from IPA. So maybe Rachel would like to take the lead on that answer.
Yes.
Sorry, my connection is cutting in and out. Can you repeat the question?
He was asking about on-site training, if IPA can facilitate that.
It's a good question. I think it depends on the training and the expense of the training. We've certainly have done trainings where we've gone to different universities or different partners to run workshops or trainings on specific topics that are of interest. Maybe it's, how do we develop theories of change, or how do we develop a research proposal, or how do you design an RCT? So we've certainly done things like that in the past. I would certainly encourage you within the country, and you'll see in a bunch of the comments that or questions I've responded to in the chat, I would certainly encourage you to reach out to the country office. Sorry? Oh, sorry, that was a comment. I would encourage you to reach out to, and this applies for everyone, to the country office, IPA country office, where you're based or where your work is, to see, what institution you're working for, what needs there might be, and whether there's opportunity for collaboration and partnership. I can't promise we're going to come in and do like a 6-series, workshop on how to do these types of things, but there's certainly opportunity and scope to come in and to do these kinds of discrete trainings. So I would say reach out and we can see what's possible.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that response. And I know we're out of time already, 3 minutes over. So to respect people's time, unfortunately, I want to pause on taking questions from the respondents or the participants as well. But I would like to give our panelists the chance to give closing remarks. So it could be very short, 30 seconds, to share something that they would like to leave with our audience. We can start off with Rachel.
Okay, great. Well, it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you. And I'm going to sound repetitive because I just said this in the last comment, but again, I would really encourage you go to our IPA website, look at the country offices, all of their general contact information on there. Look for the one that's relevant to where you work, whether where you're based or where your work is located, and reach out. Our country directors are really happy, and other members of the team are really happy to jump on a call, talk about your research ideas, see how there might be room for collaboration. So I would certainly encourage you to do that after the fact, because we're always happy to chat and see what research we might be able to work on together.
Thank you. Bianca?
Yes, I'm just going to piggyback off of what Rachel said because it is very accurate. Please feel free to reach out, especially via that email address that we shared earlier. And thank you all so much. I hope you found this helpful.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, I don't have more useful advice to say, except for the fact that I talked to one of the African scholars we have funded, and he made it clear. His name is Evans Asaboyan, and we've got a blog written about him on our website. And he said, just be determined, apply again. Everyone at whatever level, you work at MIT, you work at Makerere, University of Cape Town, Oxford, people will submit proposals and be rejected and submit again, and sometimes get funded and then submit and then get rejected. It's a game of trying again, and that's true for everyone. So please don't don't be discouraged if you do apply once and you're not accepted. Just keep going. It happens to everyone, and we want your proposals.
Great. Ethan?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining and IPA for organizing. Also happy to follow up, by email, and I would encourage people to explore all the amazing resources available on both the IPA and JPAL websites in terms of both more details about funding opportunities and eligibility, but also research resources. And but there's a lot of free information that we have on both of our websites that's aimed at trying to help people who are new to this type of research be successful. And we really hope and are trying to prioritize diversifying our research networks, and hope that many of you will be able to do more of this kind of research going forward.
Thank you. Nkechi?
Yes, thank you. So I guess my last remarks would be to say that, in putting together these grant proposals, I would encourage us all to be very deliberate about, the whole process. Give yourself enough time. Make sure that you are picking the right team based on merit. Give yourself enough time to respond adequately. And remember that, God willing, once you get this grant, be sure that your output is of the highest quality, because your name and your reputation will be attached to your deliverables. So let's just make sure that we are putting out a good record of ourselves out there, because that is one other way to be able to attract more grants in the future, and then continue to further our work. So thank you very much.
What a great way to end the session. Thank you everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. And I hope we can continue the conversations via email and social media as well. Thank you. Bye.